The stage curtains smelled like dust, rainwater, and panic. That was the first thing my second life gave me. Not a holy vision, not a countdown hovering above my head, not some gentle voice explaining that fate had made a clerical error and decided to return a ruined girl to the day before she was destroyed. Just curtains, heavy red velvet brushing my shoulder while I stood in the side wing of the old assembly hall with a roll of masking tape stuck to my sleeve and a binder pressed against my ribs. On the stage, 28 desks had been arranged like a fake courtroom, each one labeled with white cards: witness, counsel, panel chair, examiner, observer. Above them, the lighting rig hummed. Below them, my classmates crowded in a bright, nervous cluster, laughing too loudly because everyone knew the public ethics practicum was the final assessment that decided our placements, our scholarships, and the little gold lines people put on their resumes to make employers lean forward.
I knew more than that.
I knew the rehearsal about to begin was not practice. It was a trap dressed as teamwork. I knew the girl standing in the center aisle with a clipboard and a blue ribbon in her hair had already decided I would be the one sacrificed when the trap closed. And I knew, because I had lived it once, that if I took my assigned chair, opened my binder, and let class monitor Serafina Vale smile at me like a saint, I would spend the next 6 years explaining why my name appeared on a fraudulent rehearsal packet I had not written, for a scheme I had not designed, in a room where everyone had promised they were only trying to help each other pass. In my first life, I had believed in group rehearsals the way hungry people believe in bread. I believed that if a class sat together the night before an assessment, shared scripts, practiced answers, corrected each other's timing, and promised not to let anyone fall, that was community. That was what Serafina called it. Anyway, she had been class monitor since first year, chosen by teachers for her perfect attendance, perfect handwriting, perfect smile, and perfect talent for making cruelty sound like organization. She sent reminder messages at midnight with little flower emojis. She arranged birthday cakes for teachers and made sure her own name appeared on every card. She cried when weaker students failed, then quietly stopped inviting them to study sessions. I used to think she was simply intense. I used to think her leadership was the reason our cohort survived. The first time this night happened, she stood exactly where she stood now and announced that she had secured a final unofficial rehearsal for our practicum. She said the faculty had left the hall open because they trusted us. She said the best way to avoid freezing in front of the assessors was to run the exact sequence together. She handed out a packet with scene prompts, role rotations, and sample ethical rulings. She told me to sit at desk 7 because desk 7 had the strongest lighting and I was so good under pressure. I remember glowing at that compliment. I remember ignoring the way her best friend smirked. I remember reading from the packet she placed in front of me, adding notes in the margin with my own pen, and signing the attendance sheet because she said the department needed proof we had all completed peer preparation. The next morning, when the assessment began, and the examiners discovered that our rehearsal packet matched a confidential practicum scenario that had been leaked from a staff account, every person in the hall went silent. Then Serafina cried. Then my annotated copy appeared on the examiner's desk. Then the attendance sheet showed my signature beside the words rehearsal coordinator. Then the class monitor, pale and shaking, whispered that I had insisted on leading the sequence because I was desperate to outrank her. By the time I realized the packet I had touched was not the packet everyone else had received, the verdict had already entered the room. So when Serafina clapped her hands in my second life and called, "Everyone on stage, please, we only have 2 hours before the doors lock," I did not move. It was such a small rebellion that no one noticed at first. A girl near the piano was still unzipping her bag. 2 boys were arguing over who had to pretend to be the hostile witness. Someone dropped a water bottle and cursed when it rolled under the front row. Serafina's friends were taping seating labels to the desks, and one of them held up the card marked Desk 7 with a smile that knew my name before I spoke. I stood in the side wing, feeling the old terror rise in me like black water, and then I let it pass. That was the strange thing about rebirth. People imagine you come back braver. You do not. You come back informed. Fear stays. It just loses the power to surprise you. I peeled the masking tape from my sleeve, folded it into a tiny square, and stuck it to the back of my binder. Then I turned around and walked down the side steps instead of climbing onto the stage. The sound of my shoes on the wooden stairs cracked through the hall. Conversation thinned. A few heads turned. Serafina's smile paused, not vanished, just paused, as if someone had pressed a finger against the hinge of a music box. "Mara," she called, sweet enough to poison tea. "Your seat is ready." I looked at desk 7, then at the packet in her hand, then at the black dome of the security camera above the lighting booth, the same camera everyone forgot existed because it looked broken. "I'm not rehearsing," I said. The hall reacted as if I had slapped someone. Not with shouting at first, but with that more dangerous silence people use when they are deciding whether your disobedience is contagious. Serafina blinked once. Her deputy monitor, Celine, gave a tiny laugh and said, "Don't be dramatic. It's just practice." That line had ruined me once. It's just practice. It's just a packet. It's just a signature. It's just one night. Every disaster in a school begins with someone making the first wrong step sound too small to refuse. I walked to the front row, set my binder on my lap, and sat facing the stage instead of joining it. "I'll watch from here." A murmur moved through the cohort. Lucas from the back row muttered that I was trying to look special. Another girl said I always did this before finals, acting fragile, so people would comfort me. Serafina lowered her clipboard and stepped toward the edge of the stage, careful to keep her expression gentle for the audience. She was always performing too. "Mara, we agreed everyone would participate. The practicum is group-based." "No," I said. "The practicum is individually assessed in a shared scenario." That made several people glance at their packets. The official instructions had said that exactly, though no one had cared because Serafina had rewritten the sentence in her summary as collaborative performance. She tilted her head. "Yes, but the department expects us to support one another." The department also said no candidate may pre-stage testimony, distribute scenario predictions, or assign speaking order outside the official draw. This time the murmur sharpened. Celine rolled her eyes. Oh my goodness, she memorized the rule sheet. I smiled, not because I felt confident, but because I remembered what happened to girls who defended themselves by sounding wounded. "I did," I said. "That's usually what rule sheets are for." Serafina came down the stage steps then, slow and graceful, the way she moved when teachers were watching. She crouched beside my row, lowering herself so that anyone looking from the outside would think she was comforting me. "Mara," she whispered, still loud enough for half the hall to hear, "you're nervous. That's understandable. You had trouble with oral assessments last semester. But if you sit out now, people will think you're refusing to contribute." There it was, the velvet knife. In my first life, that sentence would have opened me. I would have jumped up to prove I was not weak, not selfish, not the quiet girl everyone could carry. But I had already spent one lifetime bleeding for other people's opinions. I opened my binder and took out a single sheet I had printed before leaving my room, because my second life had not given me enough time for miracles, but it had given me enough time to use the library printer. At the top, in plain black ink, it read, "Declaration of Non-Participation in Unofficial Rehearsal." Beneath that, I, Mara Elian, confirm I will not participate in, receive, annotate, perform, distribute, or rely upon any unofficial practicum scenario, script, or peer-assigned role sequence prior to the assess session. I had signed it. I had time-stamped it. I had scanned it to the faculty integrity portal while Serafina was busy unlocking the hall with a key she was not supposed to have. I held it up between us. "I'm not refusing to contribute," I said. "I'm refusing to touch your materials." Her eyes flicked to the page, and for the first time since I returned, the perfect girl looked genuinely annoyed. Not frightened. Not yet. Just irritated that a tool had rolled off the table before she could use it. The first pattern break came 7 minutes later. Everyone expected Serafina to argue. Instead, she laughed, stood, and announced that she respected my boundaries. The class relaxed at once, grateful for permission to stop thinking. "Mara will observe," she said, turning my refusal into a harmless eccentricity. "The rest of us will proceed." Remember, this is only to build confidence. No one is being forced. While she spoke, Celine passed packets down the first 2 rows. They were thicker than the ones I remembered. In my first life, each packet had been stapled. This time, she had bound them with blue clips, maybe because after I had died, she had lived long enough to learn that staples were easier to compare in evidence photographs. I watched the packets move from hand to hand. I watched students flip them open and smile with relief because the pages looked official. Departmental formatting, scenario headings, rubric language, even watermarks faint enough to look accidental. A boy whispered, "She really got the actual style." A girl whispered back, "She always does." I press my fingernails into my palm and force myself not to shout. There are moments when warning people feels noble and useless at the same time. I had warned them with the rule sheet. I had warned them by refusing. I had warned them by making my absence visible. If I tried to save them harder, Serafina would twist that into proof that I knew what the packet contained. So I sat still while the room chose its leader. That was the worst part. Not revenge. Not fear. Watching people walk toward a cliff because the person holding the map had nicer handwriting. The rehearsal began with applause. Serafina insisted on it. "We need to normalize pressure," she said, so the class clapped while she took the central desk labeled panel chair. That should have been the second warning, because candidates did not choose the panel chair. Examiners did. But people love confidence more than rules. She assigned Lucas as lead counsel, Celine as ethics officer, Priya as whistleblower, and left desk 7 empty for a full minute before pretending to remember me. "Since Mara is observing," she said, bright and generous, "I'll read her transitional lines so the sequence stays complete." Celine made a theatrical sad face.
A few people laughed.
I kept my eyes on the camera dome. In my first life, I had not known the camera worked. During my disciplinary hearing, when I asked for footage, the deputy dean said the hall camera had been under review that evening. What she did not say was that the camera had captured everything, but the file was overwritten after 72 hours because no one requested preservation until it was too late. This time, before coming to the hall, I had submitted a maintenance concern through the student safety app. Assembly hall camera flashing red above lighting booth. Possible unauthorized access after hours. I had attached a photo. I had copied the security office. I had copied myself. The red light above the booth blinked once as Serafina opened the packet and began reading from the exact confidential scenario that had destroyed me. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because some traps are so arrogant they do not even bother changing shape. Then the second break came, and it was not one I expected. Halfway through the first run, the side door opened, and Professor Ilian walked in carrying a cardboard tray of tea. The whole stage froze. Professor Ilian taught professional responsibility, had the posture of a retired judge, and could silence a seminar by removing her glasses. In my first life, she had not appeared that night. Her absence had allowed Serafina to claim the hall was used casually, that no one knew the packet was improper, that I had manipulated everyone. Now she stood in the doorway looking at the stage, at the packets, at me in the front row, and at Serafina in the panel chair. For one wild second, I thought the trap would close early. Serafina recovered first. She smiled and lifted a hand. "Professor, we're just doing confidence exercises. I hope that's all right." Professor Ilian's face did not change. The hall was booked for independent reading until 8. Serafina's smile widened with relief, because she had prepared for that. "Yes, Professor. We're being very careful not to discuss actual assessed content. Just delivery." A few students nodded too quickly. I felt my pulse thud in my throat. If I spoke now, Serafina would say I was retaliating because I had refused to join. If I stayed silent, the professor might leave. But before I could decide, Professor Ilian looked directly at me. "Miss Ilian, are you participating?" Everyone turned. My mouth went dry. I lifted the declaration sheet.
"No, professor."
"I have submitted a non-participation declaration through the integrity portal." That sentence landed harder than any accusation. Professor Ilian's eyes narrowed just slightly. "When?" 6:42. She set the tea tray on a chair. "Remain where you are." Then she turned to the stage. Continue. Continue. One word, and the room changed temperature. Serafina could not stop without looking guilty. She could not proceed without being watched. She chose proceed because girls like Serafina mistake momentum for innocence. Of course, she said, though the blue ribbon in her hair trembled when she turned. The rehearsal resumed, but now everyone spoke too carefully. Lucas read his lines as if each word might be a mine. Priya stumbled over the whistleblower testimony and apologized twice. Celine whispered to Serafina, who shook her head and pointed to the next page. Professor Ilian did not interrupt. She did something worse. She sat beside me in the front row, took out her phone, and began typing. I kept my face forward, but my skin prickled with the knowledge that my small safety report had reached someone before the 72-hour clock could bury the truth. Serafina tried to redirect the energy by praising people. Excellent urgency, Lucas. Priya, more emotional conflict. Celine emphasized the duty breach. It would have sounded like leadership to anyone not watching her hands. I was watching. Every time someone hesitated, she tapped the packet, not the general rubric, not a blank prompt, but the printed scenario language. She had built a machine, and the machine needed everyone to say exactly what it had been fed. At 7:31, Professor Ilian stood and walked to the aisle. Where did these packets come from? Serafina did not blink. I compiled them from public examples and past practice material. Did you distribute them? As class monitor, yes. For confidence. Did anyone else compile them with you? Serafina turned her head, and I saw the old move forming. Her gaze drifted to my empty desk 7. Mara helped draft some structure last week, she said softly. I can check my messages if needed. The room inhaled. Professor Ilian said, do that. Serafina's phone became the third break. In my first life, messages had been my cage. She had sent me late-night notes asking for formatting help, tricking me into replying with phrases she later inserted into the packet. She had deleted her requests and kept my answers. This time, when she opened our chat thread, she found exactly 4 messages from me, all sent that afternoon after I woke up alive again. First, I will prepare independently for tomorrow's practicum. Second, I do not consent to my name, notes, or prior study work being used in any shared rehearsal packet. Third, please do not list me as coordinator, contributor, speaker, or reviewer for tonight. Fourth, I have uploaded my individual outline directly to the faculty portal. Serafina stared at the screen. Her thumb jerked once, perhaps wanting to scroll into the previous week, where in my first life she had trapped me. But Rebirth had clipped that thread before she could weave it. I had not written those old messages this time. I had not been available to be useful. There were earlier discussions, she said, voice thinning. On paper. Professor Ilian held out her hand. Show me. Serafina's deputy, Celine, moved too quickly toward a folder on the stage. That was when the hall doors opened again, and 2 security officers entered with the academy registrar behind them. The registrar was a small woman with silver hair and a talent for making disasters sound scheduled. No one leaves, she said. Not loud, not angry, just final. The whole class looked at Serafina then, and for the first time, their faith cracked in public. What happened next did not look like justice. It looked like administration, which is colder. The registrar collected 1 packet from each row. Professor Ilian asked every student to place phones face down on the desks. Security checked the hall booking system. The class whispered until the registrar said, silence during evidence preservation, and the word evidence made several people go pale. I remained in the front row with my declaration on my lap, feeling no triumph at all, only a strange exhaustion. Revenge stories make this part glitter. They forget that when a room finally sees the truth, it does not erase the room where they refused to see you before. Lucas kept glancing back at me as if I had caused the packets to exist. Priya cried silently into her sleeve. Celine's mouth had flattened into a white line. Serafina stood near the panel chair with her clipboard held against her stomach like a shield. She looked smaller without motion. Professor Ilian asked her where she obtained the hall key. Serafina said student council. The registrar checked and replied, student council access was suspended for this hall after last month's equipment audit. Serafina said the caretaker let her in. Security checked the entry log and replied, no caretaker badge accessed the side door. Serafina said she found the door open. The security officer looked at the electronic lock record and said, your class monitor badge opened it at 6:16. That was the moment the room understood that her power had always been mostly keys, lists, and people too embarrassed to question a confident girl with a clipboard. But the worst evidence had not arrived yet. At 7:52, the registrar's tablet chimed. She read the screen, then looked up at Professor Ilian. The scenario text is a controlled draft from the assessment server. A low sound moved through the class. Someone said, no, someone else whispered. We didn't know. Serafina shook her head before anyone accused her. That's impossible. It was from a public archive. The registrar swiped once. The controlled draft contains a deliberate false clause inserted by the examination board to identify unauthorized circulation. Professor Ilian turned toward the stage. Page 4, paragraph 2. Half the students flipped pages. Papers snapped like frightened birds. Lucas found it first. His face collapsed. There's a duty clause about emergency disclosure. There is no such clause in the actual rule, Professor Ilian said. It exists only in the leaked draft. The room died. Not quieted.
Died.
Because every student who had repeated that clause during the rehearsal had just placed their own voice inside the leak. Serafina gripped the clipboard so hard the metal clip sprang loose and clattered to the floor. I remembered that clause. In my first life, I had underlined it, believing it was important. The underlining had been circled and read at my hearing as proof I understood the stolen material. Now my hands were empty.
No packet. No underline. No borrowed guilt.
Celine pointed at me suddenly, desperate enough to abandon elegance. She knew. She knew it was leaked. That's why she sat out. All eyes swung back to me. There it was, the final shape of the old accusation. If a victim escapes a trap, people assume she helped build it. I stood before anyone could tell me to. My knees shook, but my voice did not. Yes, I said. I knew something was wrong. The room stirred. Serafina's eyes sharpened with hope. I lifted my declaration. Because the official instructions prohibited exactly this kind of rehearsal, and because my name was used without my consent last year in a minor peer review dispute. I protected myself by refusing materials, documenting my refusal, and notifying faculty of unauthorized hall access. That is not complicity. That is compliance. Professor Ilian looked at the registrar. The registrar nodded once. The hope in Serafina's eyes went out. They did not fail her that night. That was the fourth break, the one Serafina counted on. Nothing dramatic happened under the rehearsal lights.
No cuffs. No screaming removal.
The registrar sealed the packets in brown envelopes, photographed the seating arrangement, took statements from everyone, and ordered us to appear for the practicum the next morning as scheduled. The assessment will proceed, she said. Candidates who received unauthorized content must not reference, reproduce, or rely upon any material from tonight. Individual conduct will be reviewed. The class erupted the moment the officials left. People shouted over one another. Some blamed Serafina, some blamed Celine, some blamed me, because blaming me was familiar and required no courage. Serafina cried then beautifully. She covered her mouth with one hand and whispered that she had only wanted us to feel prepared. Lucas apologized to her. Priya hugged her. Even after evidence, even after the false clause, even after the key log, the room still bent toward the prettiest explanation. I watched it happen and understood why my first life had ended the way it did. A crowd does not need proof to protect its favorite. It needs permission. Serafina gave them tears, so they took them. Then she looked at me over Priya's shoulder, and the tears stopped where only I could see.
Her eyes were dry.
Her mouth curved by 1 millimeter. You have not won, it said. She still believed the final performance would save her. She had always been best on stage. I went back to my dorm and did not sleep. Not because I was afraid of the practicum, though I was. Not because I regretted sitting out, though part of me still heard the class calling me selfish. I stayed awake because I had one more choice to make, and this one was uglier. In my first life, after the leak scandal, I had tried to defend everyone. I wrote statements explaining that most students did not know. I argued that Serafina had pressured them. I begged the faculty not to destroy the whole cohort. That mercy became another rope around my neck. People used my words to show I was central to the event. This time, I opened my laptop and wrote a statement with no decoration. I described only what I saw. Serafina unlocking the hall, distributing packets, assigning roles, reading from the controlled scenario, attempting to attribute drafting to me, and continuing after faculty entered. I did not call her evil. I did not call the class stupid. I did not defend people who had laughed while I sat alone in the front row. At the end, I added one sentence that felt like cutting a bandage from an infected wound. I am not able to verify the knowledge, intent, or innocence of any participant other than myself. Then I uploaded the statement, placed my phone across the room, and watched dawn crawl along the windowsill. The world did not reward me with peace, but it did give me quiet, and quiet was more than I had been granted the first time. The practicum hall looked different in daylight. Less like a theater, more like a room where lies came to be weighed. The desks were still arranged in a courtroom pattern, but the labels had changed. No candidate knew their role until they entered. No one could bring personal packets. Clear folders only. Pens provided at the door. The assessors sat across the front row, 5 of them, expressionless behind tablets. Professor Ilian stood near the side wall. The registrar sat beside her with a sealed envelope. Serafina arrived last in a white blazer because of course she did. She looked delicate, injured, brave. The class made space for her. Celine whispered something in her ear. Serafina nodded like a martyr entering an arena. When she passed me, she murmured, "You should have stayed loyal." I looked at the stage. "I did," I said to myself. Her jaw tightened. The bell rang. We drew rolls from a box. Mine read Observer Advocate, a difficult position because it required speaking last, identifying ethical failures in the scenario, and explaining what should have happened without sounding accusatory. In my first life, Desk 7 had trapped me. In this life, I drew Desk 3. Serafina drew lead respondent, the most visible role, the one she wanted. She smiled when she saw it. The class relaxed again because if Serafina performed well, maybe the whole ugly night could be remembered as stress, confusion, overreaction. She stepped to the central desk, lifted her chin, and began beautifully. For 6 minutes, she was perfect. That is important. People like Serafina do not fall because they are obviously incompetent. They fall because their competence is built around control, and real pressure does not ask permission before changing the script. She opened with a polished summary of duties, spoke clearly, referenced policy, used her hands in the restrained way interview coaches teach, and made the first-year observers in the back row lean forward. Even I felt the old pull of it. The room wanted her to be innocent because she looked like success. Then the assessor, on the left, interrupted. "Candidate Vale, please address the emergency disclosure issue under Clause 14. Serafina did not hesitate. Under Clause 14, immediate disclosure is required when reputational harm to the institution may. She stopped. It was tiny, a half-breath. But everyone heard it because last night's false clause had trained us to hear that language. The actual practicum materials on our desks did not contain Clause 14. There was no emergency disclosure issue in the live scenario. The assessor looked up from his tablet. Can you identify where Clause 14 appears in today's provided materials? Serafina's eyes moved to her clear folder, then to the page, then to the sealed envelope beside the registrar. The class held its breath. "I misspoke," she said. "I meant the general duty of candor." The assessor nodded. "Then proceed without referring to unauthorized clauses." She swallowed and continued. 2 minutes later, another assessor asked Celine to respond to a whistleblower's right to counsel. Celine repeated the phrasing from page 5 of the leaked packet. Lucas did the same with the false exception. Priya avoided the fake clause but used the exact staged emotional testimony from rehearsal. One by one, the students who had trusted the packet stepped into the outline Serafina built. They did not mean to. That was the horror of it. Memorization is a leash. Under stress, people run back to the words that first promise safety. When my turn came, my palms were damp around the provided pen. Serafina looked at me with something like pleading and hatred mixed together. Maybe she thought I would soften the analysis to protect the cohort. Maybe part of me wanted to. I stood at desk 3 and forced myself to look at the assessors, not the class. The central ethical failure in this scenario is not emergency disclosure, I said. No such clause appears in the provided record. The correct issue is role contamination. When a candidate, advocate, or institutional representative relies on material outside the authorized record, they compromise the fairness of the process, even if their delivery is polished. Someone made a small sound behind me. I continued before courage could drain out. A fair assessment requires candidates to respond to the record in front of them, not to a script rehearsed elsewhere. If a participant discovers unauthorized material, the proper response is to stop using it, preserve evidence, notify the authority, and separate their own work from the compromised source. Cooperation is valuable, but it cannot override integrity. My voice shook on the last word. Not enough to break. Enough to be real. Professor Ilian watched me over the top of her glasses. The assessor in the center made a note. Serafina stared at the desk surface. For the first time, she did not look golden. She looked like a girl who had memorized the wrong future. The failure happened in front of everyone because Serafina demanded a public performance. That was the bitter symmetry. After the final candidate spoke, the assessors conferred for 11 minutes. No one moved. The hall was so quiet I could hear the old radiator ticking under the windows. When the center assessor returned to the microphone, his voice filled the room without effort. Before individual scoring is released, the panel must address an integrity matter arising during this session. Priya began crying immediately. Lucas closed his eyes. Celine whispered, "No, no, no," under her breath. Serafina sat perfectly still. The assessor continued. Several candidates referenced material not present in the authorized scenario. The panel recognizes that some candidates may have been exposed to unauthorized material during last night's unofficial rehearsal. Those cases will be reviewed individually. However, one candidate held an organizational role in obtaining hall access, distributing controlled draft material, assigning roles based on that material, and misattributing authorship when questioned by faculty. He did not say her name yet. He did not need to. The room had already turned toward her. Candidate Serafina Vale, your practicum attempt is failed for academic fraud and procedural contamination. Your class monitor privileges are revoked immediately. Your placement recommendation is suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing. Serafina stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. This is unfair, she said, and the old magic in her voice cracked against the microphone. I was helping them. Everyone used it. Everyone was there. The assessor looked at the file in front of him. Not everyone. The words landed between us like a door closing. Serafina turned on me then, because when a mask breaks, it cuts the nearest face. You planned this, she said, loud enough for the observers to hear. You knew, and let them continue. You wanted me ruined. A month earlier, a year earlier, a lifetime earlier, I would have denied it desperately because I thought innocence had to sound kind. This time, I answered slowly. I wanted you to stop using my name. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. I kept going because the hall was listening now, and I had spent too long being interpreted by people who never asked what happened. Last night, I refused the packet. I documented it. I warned you by citing the rule. You continued. Professor Ilian entered. You continued. The registrar questioned you. You tried to attach me to the materials anyway. Today, you had the chance to answer from the authorized record. You chose the leaked script. Serafina's eyes filled, but the tears had lost their audience. You're cruel, she whispered. That almost hurt. Not because it was true, but because some part of me still remembered wanting her approval. The assessor signaled security to escort her from the performance area, not in cuffs, not dramatically, but firmly enough that the room understood she was no longer in charge of where she stood. As she passed the class, no one reached for her. Celine looked at her own lap. Lucas stared at the floor. Priya wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Crowds are loyal until loyalty has a cost. The rest of the cohort did not collapse in one clean punishment. That would have been easier for a story and less honest for a life. Some students were allowed to res it because their statements showed they had not known the packet was controlled. Some were marked down because they relied on rehearsed phrases after being warned. Celine failed for helping distribute the packets and attempting to retrieve a folder when Professor Ilian asked questions. Lucas kept his place, but lost his honor recommendation. Priya passed on review because her statement admitted everything before anyone asked, and because she had not shared the material further. People whispered that I had been lucky. Then, when luck did not explain the time-stamped declaration, the safety report, the portal upload, and the clean performance, they whispered that I had been cold. I let them. Cold was what people called a girl who stopped setting herself on fire to keep a room warm. 3 days later, the merit board posted individual results. My name appeared in the top band, not first, not crowned, not surrounded by fireworks, but there, clean and official, beside the placement route I had lost in my first life. Professor Ilian found me staring at the list after everyone else had gone.
You spoke well, she said.
Praise from her felt like being handed something heavy and breakable. Thank you, I said. She adjusted the strap of her bag. You also understood something many students learn too late. When a group asks for your integrity as the price of belonging, it is not a group. It is a future witness list. Then she left me alone with the board. A week later, Serafina's mother came to the academy. I saw her through the glass wall of the administration wing, wearing pearl earrings and the expression of a woman prepared to purchase a different version of events. She sat with the dean for 40 minutes. She left pale. By afternoon, the official notice changed from placement suspended to disciplinary exclusion, pending external reporting. That phrase traveled faster than any rumor we had ever shared. The class monitor who had once controlled seating charts, study groups, birthday cards, and teacher gifts was no longer permitted to represent the academy in any practicum, competition, or placement program. Her name was removed from the leadership board. Her locker was cleared by staff. The blue ribbon she always wore appeared in the lost property box on Thursday, folded neatly beside a cracked umbrella. I stood in front of it for longer than I should have. I expected satisfaction to arrive like music. Instead, I felt tired, and then sad, and then free in a way that did not need to smile. She had not been a monster under a bed. She had been a girl with power, fear, ambition, and a talent for making other people disposable. That was worse because it meant everyone who followed her had made a choice, and so had I. On the last day of term, the academy held a replacement rehearsal for the students approved to res it. Official this time. Supervised. Blank scenarios.
No packets.
No class monitor. I was asked to attend as a peer observer, and for 1 second, standing outside the hall, I almost refused. The old curtains still smelled like dust and rainwater. The desks still looked like little verdicts waiting to happen. Then I saw Priya inside, sitting alone with her hands folded, terrified of speaking, and I remembered the difference between revenge and repair. Revenge had been sitting out when the rehearsal was poisoned. Repair was entering when the room was clean. I took a seat in the front row and watched them practice without scripts, without leaked clauses, without Serafina's voice telling them confidence was the same as obedience. They stumbled. They forgot points. They laughed nervously. They started again. When Priya stood to give a response, she looked at me once, not asking for rescue, just asking whether falling apart meant she was finished. I nodded because I could.
She spoke.
Her voice shook. She passed anyway. That was the ending I kept for myself, not the public failure, not the revoked privilege, not the moment everyone saw Serafina let out of the assessment area. The real ending was quieter. It was a room full of students learning that preparation without honesty is just rehearsal for disgrace. It was my own hands resting empty on my lap. No stolen packet. No borrowed guilt. No signature on a lie. In my first life, I had climbed onto the stage because I was afraid of being left out. In my second, I sat out and learned the truth. Sometimes the only way to save your future is to let the wrong performance begin without you.